what we thought we would open with here in this next session is something directly related to concerns about disruption, hopefully not deteriorating into violence, on Election Day, and that is the internal management of the polling place and the role of observers and in particular watchers. And as I know members of the media here know, there has been a push in a number of states to redefine and to give, if you will, more access to poll watchers. And long and short of it is, I mean, that is a concern about whether or not that's going to create problems for internal polling place management. So there is not disruption of the operations of the polling place, plus whatever effects it's clearly going to have on voters if things get out of hand. And so I thought we thought we would start by asking, how do you see this problem? How are you preparing for the problem? Have you seen any changes in your state laws? How do you guide our colleagues here in the media on this question of challenges within the polling place, observation within the polling place, and its relationship to the stable and appropriate management of the polling place?
Start with Arizona.
Let's do that.
And poll watchers really do play an important role, and that this process, this voting process in person on Election Day in Pennsylvania proceeds in a way that is transparent. And in my former life, worked to recruit poll watchers on behalf of parties, on my party, on behalf of candidates, and also to fill seats on election boards that were vacant, to make sure that those election boards are bipartisan. The 5 people who volunteer for about 14 hours to make sure that your vote can be cast and can be counted. They do play a really important role in transparency, but it's important that when they're getting instructions on it, that they understand what they can't do as well in terms of interfering with the voting process, or in terms of harassing voters or intimidating them in some way, or advocating on behalf or against any candidate.
So agreed in Arizona, political party observers, that's a very important part of the process. They have to be designated in writing by the county party chairs, and they're involved in the process from start to finish. So logic and accuracy testing, pre-election, early voting, through the early boards, through Election Day at the polls, afterwards, up until recounts. So you do bring up a very good point, Pennsylvania, and that's training. Because we have to have, poll workers have to be trained by state law, and we don't have that same state law on observers. And the parties may or may not train them, but did the parties train them on the basic things they need to know? Like in Arizona, we have an electioneering rule of 75 feet. That's not the same in every state. So do they know what that rule is and what's allowed? Provisional ballots, that's very confusing for observers. So a lot of times observers will say they've seen all these things that are illegal happening that are not, but they don't know because they don't know the laws, because they're not training. So I've long been supportive of having even an hour-long online class for these observers so that they understand what is that 75-foot line, who gets a provisional ballot and when, what IDs needed at the polls. That would be really helpful.
Well, I may have a different perspective than you, so go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, I'll just say, good news from Georgia, we have that law. We got it after 2020. The political party or poll watchers have to go through training from their appointing entities now. In addition to that, many of us, myself included, offer optional training about our local processes. And because it's important to know what they're observing, what to do if they see something that's not going right. And this is different than what's called a challenge in other states. In Georgia, poll watchers observe what's going on. If they see something wrong, they alert who appointed them or the election office, not the poll manager, where other states, they have more of a role of challenging what poll workers are doing. But the other thing I wanted to mention is, talking about the layout of a polling place, an in-person site. In Georgia, there's a public area. When you first walk in, before you're checked in, if you're just a member of the public, you want to walk in and see what's going on, if there's space for you, you can, as long as you're not causing a problem. But if you want to go beyond that, where people are being checked in, where ballots are being voted or scanned, you have to be appointed, you have to be trained. And as you mentioned, It's just an important part of the process. I don't want to tell folks, trust me, in 2020, well, what saved me in 2020, one of the things was that I got angry phone calls. I could answer their questions, then refer them to a chosen local party, and say, if you don't like what they tell you about what they saw, call me back. I didn't get a single phone call back. The parties were there, they observed without causing a problem, without causing a disruption, knowing where the lines fell, knowing what the rules were. They did a great job. They supported me, and I'm eternally grateful for that.
I think Joseph did a great job of explaining that there is a difference. And the question really is to the voter out there, do you want to make a difference? You can be a watcher, or you can be a poll worker. I'm a worker, not a whiner. So come join us and be a poll worker.
No, seriously, I think Brad's absolutely right. It's just what a wonderful way to learn about the process and to be involved in the process. And then, you feel some ownership. And if you have ownership over something, then maybe you'll be a little more sensitive to when people say that everyone who was involved in this process was wholesale corrupt. Most social science studies show that the class of people who has the most confidence in the criminal justice system are people who have recently served as jurors. I dare say there would be a similar study that would be executed in terms of who has trust in elections. I would imagine the people who are actually working the process, getting trained in the process, working along people who are of different political stripes and different political backgrounds toward the end. So yeah, as Brad said, be a poll worker.
Quickly, both my local parties are complaining now because I've hired all their poll watchers as poll workers, so they're trying to find more.
And this dovetails, like the Secretary and Stephen, this dovetails nicely with the point Kim made earlier. The people who put on elections in my county, which is all I really know about, they're your Aunt Mary. They're your son and daughter. These are people you know, and you may not know this, but our county is in presidential elections quite purple, and we usually do get right who the president's going to be. And the people who are running our elections are Republicans and independents and Democrats, all working together, hand in hand, in cooperation, watching each other, if you will. And I never hear any of them talking about any chicanery on Election Day or in our mail-in ballot process at all. And folks, there's so many eyes on this process. If anyone was trying to cheat you, it's not your Aunt Mary, because no one's trying to cheat you. Yeah. And it's your Aunt Mary, yes.
So certainly agreed on the comments on encouraging people to be poll workers. I think there is a parallel there with poll watchers and challengers as well, though, which is that the more experienced folks, the ones who've been doing it, the ones who are trained by the political parties, regardless of which party it is or which civic group it is, we really have not had problems with those experienced challengers in the past. Where we have problems are when people show up, because they got an email or at the last second and they've been told something's going wrong. They come into the middle of election process that they know nothing about, and then they start causing trouble. So we have updated a lot of our challenger guidance to try to make some of that more clear for election officials. But the other thing, if things do go sideways, is our legislature did pass a law that makes it a crime to threaten an election worker. So if it does come to that, we do have some legal protections in place. But our goal is, and especially we depend on our county and municipal clerks for this, to communicate with the organizations and with the challengers and get them as educated as we can.
I would just, I think we've talked about the key being training, making sure these poll challengers are adequately trained. It's so critical that they fully understand their role and their responsibility and the scope with which they have that role in. I would also kind of mirror that along the lines with our election inspectors, our election workers. So I don't think it's just enough to train the poll challengers. I think we need to make sure that our election inspectors have an expectation set, that they understand that this could be, you could encounter poll challengers at your precinct. And so rather than have this unexpected, almost combative relationship. This is part of the process. I know what they are able to do, and I know that role. I know it's coming, and we're really all a part of the process together. So I think education both for the poll challenger and for our election inspector. And then you take that a step further when you're leading up to the elections, when you're talking to our partners in the press, you set that expectation with the voters as well. So they're not caught off guard when they see, a poll challenger, don't know what they're doing, don't know why they're there, what their role is. It's really just a matter of having everybody understand the role that each one of them plays and just having those expectations set.
So in Wisconsin, anyone can be an observer. No training is required. All you have to do is come in, show your ID, and sign in. We give you what's called the Rules at a Glance pamphlet, and those are the rules you need to follow. They can challenge voters for eligibility. We don't see that often, though we've had that a little bit more recently. I would love for them to have training so they understand how the system works. We did the presidential recount in 2016 for our entire state, and I spent most of my time explaining election law to lawyers from outside of our state. So it would be really awesome if we had some quick training that they could take. Some of our political parties.
Just to add on that from Wisconsin, so you know how Ben earlier said that we might take a trip to election Nerdsville? Well, we should all buckle up because the commission's done something really cool and they've started to promulgate an administrative rule. And so I won't go into detail about that, but that's, if we want to talk about Nerdsville, that's Nerdsville. But the administrative rule process, they actually brought in a whole group of people across the political spectrum to talk about election observers and what the rules should be. Because right now our statute just says that an election observer has to be 3 to 8 feet from where the voting is happening. Well, what does that mean, right? What can the observer see? What can the observer interact with? What are their rights? What's a voter's right to make sure that they don't feel intimidated by the observation? And so the commission did a 2-year-long committee where we met with people that if they met in another circumstance, they probably wouldn't agree on a single thing. But they met as part of this committee for administrative rule to talk about what should the fine points of the observer rule look like. And I think they came up with some really strong proposals as part of that. And so we've hit some roadblocks with our legislature in terms of getting that over the finish line, but our hope is that it's really going to help, like everyone said, to clarify what the roles are moving forward, because I think where you have these ambiguous policies and procedures is where you find issues, right? Because people don't know exactly what to expect. They don't know what they should be allowed to do. And then later you have all these challenges or people saying, well, I don't know if the election was fair because I wasn't close enough to see it, right? And so we're really hoping that we'll be able to get this rule across the finish line and have some clarity in those processes moving forward.
Well, I can echo Megan's Nerdville. But we did not get as long a runway. There were some changes enacted in our law about observers, and therefore we then had to promulgate rules in our administrative code. Those were adopted by the state board in the way that we function in North Carolina, but then they also have to be approved by the Rules Review Commission. There is public comment to those, so there's a lot of vetting that goes on, but it's a shorter window of time that we had to work under. Some of those changes reflect, one, that observers have been permitted in North Carolina for decades. I don't even know how far back. The role of an observer has changed in a lot of ways, but their own perceived role, or the political party's version of their role or vision of their role. In days of old, I think we can all remember that an observer was there to see how many people had checked in, keep track of their list, and then a runner would come and get the list so that they could go and knock on doors and get people out to vote. That was what they were observing, is who has shown up and who do we need to get there before the polls close. Now it is a matter of watching what is taking place and potentially drawing into question the conduct of the election. What makes this interesting in North Carolina is that the observers are put forward by the political parties. There's timeliness to that, and when those must be received by the counties or the state board, depending on their designation as an observer. But they're observing people who have also been appointed by the political parties. We have bipartisan teams of officials working at our voting sites that the political parties have put forward as their election workers to work in a bipartisan fashion to carry out the conduct of the election at the voting sites. And so I have found that to be interesting, that you're calling into question the very people that your political party appointed you as an observer, but also appointed those folks working there. And as was so well said, these are members of the church choir, the former biology teacher, or perhaps your basketball coach when you were coming along, who are working side by side. And those folks, in order for there to be a question on the conduct of election, imagine the collusion that would have to take place for there to be, deceit in the conduct of our elections. We do not have training for our political observers, but we have done public education. We have a series of videos so that the voter understands what their role is, and that they are not to interfere with them in their active voting. They still can go to the voting booth and have privacy to cast a secret ballot. But the law did change that gives the observer more freedom to move about the voting enclosure than what they used to have. But to adjust for that in those administrative rules, we did designate that they will be indicated as an observer with a badge or name tag, something so it's clear to the voter that they're there to observe, and if you have an issue in casting your ballot or need assistance, go to that precinct official who is working. Tim, anything else you'd add?
So a couple things to add to Karen's point, and then we kind of have a similar issue as Joseph in Georgia, where a lot of our poll observers are becoming poll workers, which is a fantastic thing for us in terms of workforce, right? So with respect to the poll worker, poll observer dynamic or that relationship, it lends to a checks and balances in a way where one party is the oversight, right, and then the other party is the administrators, and so they're essentially keeping an eye on each other, as well as the bipartisan precinct officials that are keeping an eye of each other. Now, with possible fear of poll workers or poll observers going rogue, there's safeguards in place through the process that protects the voting process and ensures that there's redundancies, there's a chain of custody process, there's plenty of documentation, right? A paper trail that documents all the activities and functions within a polling place. Lastly, our poll workers, by state law, are required to swear or affirm to an oath. And from my experience, they take that oath very seriously. And they do so with the understanding that there are criminal penalties involved if they were to go rogue or to go outside the bounds of the rules in place. So that, again, that's another document that memorializes their function out at the polling place.
Let's talk real quickly about how votes are actually counted once the polling places close. In other words, what is the process in the county level and then up to the state level to get results? So Tim, can you start off talking about the way you set up your polling places and how it moves up the food chain?
So at least in my county, in Forsyth County, North Carolina, I'll start. We do have 3 separate forms of voting methods: absentee by mail, early voting, and election day in-person voting. With respect to the absentee by mail ballots, they have already been reviewed by our 5-member board, bipartisan board, thanks to the pre-processing laws that are available in North Carolina. And so beginning on the 5th Tuesday before Election Day, all 100 county boards of elections meet on a weekly basis to review and disposition any of the absentee ballots that have been returned at that point. And so, again, in a public meeting setting on election day, our board will tabulate the absentee ballot results at 7:30. As for the early voting ballots, those are the machines or the tabulators are closed at 7:30, and then those results are uploaded as well. Out at the polling places on election night, our bipartisan precinct officials at each site are responsible for verifying all the security seals on the voting machines. They're responsible for closing down those tabulators together and printing multiple copies of the results tape. Again, so I mentioned earlier about redundancies and plenty of documentation. And the reason for having these multiple copies of the results tape is, especially in our county, we have sort of a separation of power. We don't allow for one individual or one precinct judge to maintain possession of all the materials, all the ballots, all the USB stick that contains the results. We enable for a separation of power, which adds an extra layer of security, where we have our help desk official bring in the first copy of the results tape and the thumb drive with the results, and then they're later followed by the chief judge with a second copy of the results tape and the ballots and other materials. And so that in itself allows for, an ability to double check and to ensure that whatever the help desk official brought back is validated with what was brought back by the chief judge. In the other counties in our states, they have some form or fashion of the returns, of handling the election night returns. I know one county, they'll have one of their precinct judges mail in the second copy of the tape that's then returned to the Board of Elections the day after or the following day. And that can then be used to cross-check and validate the results from the first copy of the tape. So again, that's just a safeguard that validates the accuracy of the results. The precinct officials are also responsible for verifying that for every ballot that's cast, there's an equal number of signed voter applications. Right? So there is a reconciliation process that I'm sure all states undergo at their polling places, where you can't have an extra ballot or one more ballot than you would a signed voter application, or otherwise you've identified a discrepancy. So that's sort of out at the polling places. In terms of the results being uploaded and displayed for public consumption, we go through a process that's called air gapping, where the vote tabulation computer is not connected to the internet, just like our voting machines. And so as we're uploading the results from these individual USB thumb drives, we then have to copy those results into a network computer that can then be displayed on our websites, shared with the media. But what air gapping is where we take a blank USB thumb drive to copy the accumulated results, the aggregated results, into this network computer, but we don't reuse that same stick. We're using a fresh, brand new stick to copy the next set of results. Because once it's touched that network computer, we don't want to introduce that to the not network vote tabulation computer. And so, this prevents malware from being introduced into that computer. But those are the steps that we take to ensure the safeguarding and security of our election night tabulation process.
Yeah, thank you. And we wanted to give you that thorough explanation because there is that in every state with some variations. But it's important to realize that. But we want to jump right to the certification process because many of you have asked some questions about precisely how that works and how the certification of results, once they're produced, does that. So we want to give you that from both the county level and then the state level. And we've asked our friends in Pennsylvania to tee this up. So, Chet?
Sure. Yeah, in our election night process is very similar to what you heard here in North Carolina. except for one key thing that we have to stress every election, that we have two sets of sticks out in the field. One is read on election night, and that is the unofficial results. That stick is never touched again. We post those results on election night, we send them to the state on election night, and they remain unofficial for its entirety. The following day after election, after we've added in our mail-in ballots on election night and the tabulation at the polls, we will take the other stick, and now we start building our official. We have two sets of computers in our tabulation room. One's an unofficial, one's an official. Everything that happened on election night was unofficial. So anything you see coming out of Allegheny is never official. It's always unofficial until the 20-day deadline to certify. So once we do the election day, we do the unofficial. Now we start with the official. We'll take the other stick that has not been touched and put them into the official network. On Friday, we convene the canvassing board, and that canvassing board, it's a public event. It's basically all 50 of our election people who are sworn in. They'll do things like count the remaining military ballots that come in up until Tuesday, provisional ballots. I think you're going to have some patience with Allegheny with provisional ballots. In 2020, we had 17,000 provisional ballots cast. And so they take time to canvass. And so as all this stuff's occurring, up until the 20 days, we are adding to this official total. If a race is close, the state will ask, how many ballots do you have left? How many provisionals do you have left? How many military do you have out there? Because they're trying to figure out whether it has met the threshold for the 0.5% statewide recount. So they're constantly monitoring that. And so as this progresses, we do that. We also do 3 different audits. We spoke about audits before, hand counting. We do an RLA audit, a 2% audit, an essential scan audit before the 20 days, and various other housekeeping issues. We do a reconciliation during that 20 days where some of our staff will look at the tapes, like we talked about on election night. We do that during the canvassing board, where they look at the tapes, look at the register, the number list of voters, and say, this thing is off by 5. Let's figure out why, or it's good. And they do all of that, try to get to an end point where we could say to our election board, these are everything we have. These are our final results, and then our election board, before the 20-day deadline, votes on certifying that and signs off on that. And then we submit to the secretary our final result.
Once the counties certify within that required 20-day deadline, the deadline for us in our election code is that we certify forthwith. So it sounds very Shakespearean. It might as well be like post haste. But I assure you, there's great urgency. There's no waiting around for some. And obviously, we have to look at the election calendar, or not the election calendar. We have to look at the required deadlines from ECRA and from everything else that are in place to make sure we meet that, whether it's for president or any other office.
All right, so a lightning round for all the states. Must the county election board certify? Is it discretionary or is it mandatory? Lisa, you get to start, or Arizona gets to start.
I know a little bit about this topic. Ben, being a former election official in a county that did not certify until they got a court order.
What's happening with them now?
They're under indictment.
Yeah, okay.
So there's that. They're under indictment. There are consequences, right? So it's a ministerial duty for counties to conduct their canvass of the election and then send those results to the state.
It's Northampton County's opinion that Pennsylvania law, it is mandatory to certify.
I think it's clear in Georgia law, it's mandatory that we certify. It's a specific comparison we make. If the comparison holds true, if we have to investigate at the end of that process, we certify, and that's an indication we're done. And that's just what it is.
And then I have to certify my office. November 22nd. Counties, November 12th this year. State, Secretary of State's office, November 22nd.
Michigan?
Michigan's constitution requires county boards of canvassers to certify based on the election returns.
Wisconsin law makes it mandatory to certify unless there were some kind of legitimate dispute that had to be settled by a court. It is mandatory. So let's say that they did do their canvass and they found that there was some kind of issue, right? There was a problem. Then perhaps they'd have to go to court to have that discrepancy settled before they certified. But I think that if they have, legitimate results, then there's no issue with the results that they're required to certify.
It's not discretionary on the part of the county official, though.
The word in North Carolina's law is they shall.
And if a county certification is held up and it's not outcome determinative, can you still file a certificate of ascertainment for the presidential race? Words, there is one county in dispute. It is not outcome determinative for the statewide presidential race. Can the state go ahead and certify? You may say you want to ask your lawyers this, but
Yeah, my lawyers would probably announce it or say to it another way, but the comparison I would draw is that there are times when we do have a recount continuing or a protest or an election dispute because of the closeness of an election, or many of you are familiar with the 9th Congressional District where we had to hold a new election in 2019 because of ballot harvesting. So there could be cause for the county board or the state board to not certify an individual contest, but be able to certify the others. And the thought that it would be so close in a presidential election that they would not be certifying that contest, I think we can move past that one.
So I think that, our state law has deadlines for each county to submit their certified canvass results. So we also have 3 levels. So it's the municipal too. They have to certify their results at the municipal level, then it goes to the county, then it goes to the state. All 3 levels have a deadline by which they have to submit their certified results. So I think that if a county didn't submit their certified results to us, we would probably have to initiate some kind of mandamus action or something in order to get that from them so that we could stay on track to meet our statutory deadline.
So in Michigan, if a county board of canvassers does not certify, the state board does it. So you couldn't stop an election result by failing to certify. What you could do, though, is cause a huge amount of harm to your community by basically throwing away the work of your county clerks and municipal clerks, and then also wasting a lot of time and money when the state has to do it all over again.
Good question. I wasn't prepared for that answer, so I'll get an answer before we finish this up. I'd like to check with legal to see what they were going to tell me. Thank you.
If it helps at all with all the discussion about certification in Georgia with the state election board, I think every single person involved in the discussion has said publicly at some point the counties have to certify by the deadline to certify.
I just referenced Shakespeare, but to quote Lucille from Arrested Development, one of my favorite shows, I don't understand your question and I refuse to answer it. Obviously, if any counties refuse to certify, as we had 3 counties do in the primary of 2022, we would immediately take them to court to compel them to certify. And we're confident, because how clear the election law is in Pennsylvania, that the courts would expeditiously require those counties to certify their election results, and then we could move forward from there.
Similar to Arizona, because if the county doesn't, then the state would sue to get them to canvass the election. If they refuse to canvass at that point, it would go back to court, and the state could actually move forward without their results. So again, causing huge problems for those officials in those counties.
I just want to touch on something. Please know that this is the extreme exception and not the rule. Our boards of canvassers, by and large, and almost always do such a great job. They go into that room diametrically opposed to each other in terms of policy and philosophy, but they go, they sit down, they have a job to do, and they do it together, precinct by precinct, counting board by counting board, early voting site by early voting site. It's a pride of ownership, and I think, in my opinion, the canvas and the certification process is my favorite part of the process. It's kind of that final backstop, that final check and balance to the to ensure that the election results are accurate. But again, this system works, and it's the exception and not the rule when a county may try and be disruptive.
Okay, we're going to do a lightning round with recounts. Hopefully, we're not awash in recounts in weeks from now, but who pays? Are they done by hand? Who can request? Are they mandatory? Then we're going to have plenty of time for questions, and then we're going to have wrap-up remarks. So, shall we start with recounts over here in Arizona and go around?
Automatically triggered by state law, you can't request half of 1%, government pays.
I want to applaud Arizona. That is what I mean by a lightning round. Thank you.
Skip.
I'd like to pass while I'm hearing the answer to the question that I'm about to answer. We have a half of 1% margin for statewide races, which would trigger an automatic recount, and the Commonwealth taxpayers, the Commonwealth pay for it if that's the case.
So the county boards can do a discretionary recount prior to certification. Secretary of State can request a recount when appropriate, and then at 0.5% margin, the candidate can request and the state pays, or the county pays.
Only the losing.
Oh, losing, excuse me.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
So in Michigan, county level local recounts can be requested by candidates or individuals with standing on a proposition. Fraud or mistake has to be alleged but not necessarily proven. There's a sliding scale of how much the complainant essentially is required to pay for the recount because depending on the margin of loss, depending on the margin of and then I believe at the statewide level, Jonathan isn't right, it's a margin of 2,000 votes statewide initiates a statewide recount on a state issue. Yeah. Forthwith and post haste.
So in Wisconsin, the recount must be requested. It has to be within 1%. And if it's within, it's only free if it's within 0.25%. The candidate must pay, and they must prepay to do that recount. And it must be the aggrieved candidate.
Which is a change to our law. In 2016, we had Jill Stein request a recall of the presidential race, who wasn't one of the aggrieved candidates, so our law was changed, so it has to be one of the aggrieved candidates. Oh, and another fun fact is that they can choose if they want to do statewide, a particular county, a particular municipality, and in 2020, of course, the aggrieved candidate chose to only audit or only recount Wisconsin's 2 largest counties.
The cost of a recount is, the county bears that cost. There's no charge to the candidate. The only candidate who can call for a recount is the second place finisher. We won't get into a multi-seat race, but just leave it at that. And if it's a county office, they can request a recount if 1% or less margin. If it is a statewide race, it has to be within 10,000 votes or less in order to call for the recount. The recount is a machine recount initially, depending on how those results or the outcome of those results. Then we may move to a sample hand-to-eye count or a sample count done by hand. It just, we go from there. But we start with a machine recount.
Earlier, you were talking about training poll watchers. Sorry? Oh. Sure, sorry. Earlier, you were talking about training poll watchers, and I was just curious, the RNC has been doing these Protect the Vote poll watcher trainings. Does that qualify, or are you talking more about state trainings? When I went to one of those, it was really not transparent what they're actually doing in those trainings, so I was just curious what your thoughts are. Oh, sorry, I'm with CBS News. Katrina Kaufman.
In Georgia, we put into law that it's actually the poll worker training for the poll observers. So if we're going to go through and do all that work, then why not be a poll worker? And it really is just a whole lot better.
And more specifically, though, the political parties have provided the training for their poll watchers. I'm not sure who they're partnering with, but it could go all the way up the line. I think they're getting information from the state party, then tailoring it for the county. There may be some involvement there. I'm just not sure.
If it's okay, just to add to that. So in my county, in O'Connell County, Wisconsin, we have welcomed observers because it is part of our state statute. So we view them as a vital part of the process. As many eyes that can see the good work that we do, I want in the room. So we have done some observer training. And yes, some local parties have also done that. And they have shared their platform with me. So I've been able to see that and maybe tweak it a little bit to make sure that we're getting the accurate information out. But we do that in conjunction with some of our public tests. So not only are we showing them what to watch for, but we're doing it during like what they would be watching. They'd be watching the tabulation of the votes too. So we've done some of that locally.
Yeah, so this is one where it's going to vary a bit state to state, but in terms of Michigan, the important thing is that the training has to include the requirements of the Michigan election law. So parties can do their own trainings, civic groups can do their own trainings, but they have to make sure that when their challengers show up, they know what the election law requirements are.
Let me just touch on that. Another thing is we do see some of these trainings pop up, and some of them are national or whatnot. And a lot of times we'll get people that come into Allegheny County, and you have to be a registered voter of Allegheny County to be a poll watcher. And we'll get people to show up at our office and say, well, I'm from Virginia, and I'm representing whatever campaign, and we have to turn them away. And so, especially elections like this, there's a lot of misinformation that you could just waltz in, and as long as you represented a candidate, you could become a poll watcher, and it's just not true, and we have to turn away many, many people. And some people even lie about where they live, and then we have to look them up in the database. It's gone that far, so just want to put that out there.
Hey, Justin Glaw. I'm a freelancer. I write an extremely optimistic newsletter called American Doom, and this question is for Secretary Raffensperger. I just need a little bit of clarification. If a county refuses to certify their results, do you then count that county's results, and can that then go on for Governor Kemp to sign a certificate of ascertainment, or do you feel that a writ of mandamus would be necessary to compel them to certify? I just wanted to get clarification on Ben's question from earlier on that front.
I set up an organization, Election Defense Fund Incorporated, but we will, one way or the other, go to court and go to a Superior Court judge. But they have a requirement that they shall. It's just black letter law that they shall do that. So we're going to go to court and, ask the judge to, direct them to certify the results.
And if I may add one thing, one of the things we do on election night in Georgia is upload results to the state multiple times election night reporting site. The vast majority of results will be reported to the state on election night, and they're not certified, so that information will exist besides the work we're doing afterwards. Just wanted to flag that it's not they're going to be hoarding things at the county level and not telling anybody what those results are.
Going back to the point about trainings and observers, I'm curious to hear from you what would characterize a disruption from observers at polling locations, because that does seem like that is one of the areas that we're going to be hearing quite a bit about.
In Wisconsin, that's up to the chief inspector of each polling place to determine whether or not something has reached the level of a disturbance. Now, we never want that to be the case, right? And there's no real clear statutory line for that. And I think the training for the poll workers is always, let's try to get somebody, in and out without causing a disturbance, because sometimes interacting with that person is going to cause more of a disturbance than is already happening. So, let's say somebody comes in and they're electioneering, they're wearing all kinds of gear for a candidate on the ballot or something like that. I think talk to them briefly, but try to get them in, voted, and out the door. But if it's something that rises to the level of a disturbance, or if other voters feel like they're being intimidated or unable to safely navigate the process, then the chief inspector has the statutory authority to intervene, to bring in law enforcement if they needed to resolve that situation.
So in North Carolina, Karen alluded to earlier about administrative rules as it pertains to poll observers. There is one simple line that says if they, in the event, interfere or impede with the voting process, that is sort of the standard that the chief judges at our polling places would apply. So any disruption of the voting process where it impedes the voter's ability to cast their ballot, that's sort of the standard rule.
I would say in Michigan it's similar, so any interference at all with the voting process, we want people there. We welcome the observers and the challengers there. But if they're impeding the voting process in any way or interfering with the work of the election official in processing voters, and that's why I think de-escalation training is so important and something that we've focused on, locally for us as well.
One thing we struggled with in Philadelphia in 2020 was a discrepancy between what election observers thought they could do at our central tabulation center and what they were actually permitted in the law to do. So when people on the outside were saying, no, these election observers get to go in, they're scrutinizing every ballot, they're scrutinizing every signature and all that, that doesn't exist in Pennsylvania and never has. But one thing that we did after 2020 as a lesson learned, and I'm really just speaking about Philadelphia, was it's not so much training, it's more like an open house for those observers so that they can come in and familiarize themselves with the tabulation center, what each station is, what everybody is doing, and what they're permitted to do and not permitted to do.
Hi, Jackie Kucinich with the Boston Globe. I've asked a couple of you this question individually, but I'm curious to hear from others. The perception that, once after election day is over, you're going to get your results. It's definitely part of the culture. How do you re-level set with voters that perhaps you're going to have to wait a couple days, as many of you have said, because it takes time to count these votes?
With y'all. We need y'all to teach the public that knowing who won election night is not the norm. It never has been, and we shouldn't expect it to be. We should release results quickly. We should be transparent. But frankly, it's watching the news that gave them that idea in the first place. And it's going to take y'all helping us to educate them, to teach them something else.
If I could follow up on that, as I mentioned earlier, but in Georgia, all the absentee ballots that are received Saturday before the election, they'll be ready for tabulation, press the button at 7:01, and they're going to be uploaded. She'll have that. Now, if there's absentee ballots that got in the mail Monday and Tuesday, you have to go through that process. But that'll be a small portion. 65% of the early vote totals will be reported right within 1 hour, so by 8 p.m. you'll have those. But then that's election night reporting, and that's what takes some time. The rules that we have in place right now, that by and large will happen by 12 midnight. But you still may not have all of it there, and the question is, how close is this race in Georgia? Is it 2,000 votes? Is it 20,000 votes? We don't know what it's going to be. But I will say this, everyone talks about Florida, they know what their results are, and they're done before all these other states. They're probably not done any faster than all of us here at this table, but they had a 350,000 person delta that President Trump led by 350,000. They were still counting ballots, but it didn't matter because there weren't enough outstanding ballots. Whereas here, it's every single ballot matters because it's so close. And sometimes it takes a little bit longer based on the policies that you have in place or state laws you have to follow. What about France? Well, Stephen Richer, there's a camaraderie. That question is about what about France? Because people say, well, they did this over really in the parliamentary systems of France. It's because there's one candidate. If you look at our ballots in Georgia or any of these states or any place in the country, you probably have 10 or 20 or even 30 people. In Fulton County, Georgia, we vote for county surveyor. Down in Glenn County, Georgia, they vote for the Water and Sewer Board. We have all these races, and it all just takes time. And so it's a very complicated ballot, and we do a really good job in America of getting it all to come together at the end of the day.
I've had 2 European newsreaders in my office in the last 2 weeks who were just floored by the size of the ballot for this election. Couldn't comprehend that method of voting, just like we have a hard time comprehending how they do what they do.
I think it's important to keep in mind, though, that what we're doing adheres to our state laws. So yes, the results that we can provide on election night are the unofficial results, and they are the vast majority of outcomes. But our laws, and each state may have slightly different, but we have other ballots that can be considered. In North Carolina, the military and overseas ballots can still be considered as long as they're received within 9 days of the election. We all have made mention of provisional ballots, and that's where someone's presented themselves to vote, but did not appear on the roll, and we need to determine why. There may be other circumstances of why they're voting a provisional ballot, but we're going to research that. And it may be that their voter registration did not process over from Department of Motor Vehicles, but they were an eligible voter. And now that in our case, the county boards of elections are going to consider that and whether to cast that ballot. But that's part of the certification period. And not only are we considering some additional ballots, we are certifying, we are proving the accuracy of the votes that were reported as unofficial. Many of the processes we've already talked about, some different, and that's when we get into post-election audits and comparison of voter history to ballots cast and so forth. But I think Secretary Raffensperger said it so well. We get these questions because we have close contests. The state justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court was decided by 401 votes. So yes, people are concerned. How many provisional ballots do you have? How many military and overseas ballots do you still have outstanding? And our state law did change in terms of absentee by mail ballots. We did have a grace period in effect until recently, and now we have to have those in by 7:30 p.m. on election day.
Yeah, I would just add, as much time as can be invested on the front end by media in terms of speaking with both the state and the local officials about the specifics of the process by which these unofficial results are coming in, that makes a huge difference. I mean, of course, we have different times our polling places close, and based on the state, we may have a different order in terms of when you're going to get the in-person ballots first or the absentee ballots reported first. So as much detail as can be provided, we have, when you turn on the news on election night, there's a great amount of detail about all the little counties and, whether they're red and blue. If there can be something like that level of detail about what's going on behind the scenes while we're waiting for these results to get reported, I think it can be helpful. And the thing I compare it to is like if you're on the airplane and you're sitting at the gate, people usually feel a lot better if the pilot's getting on there and telling you, okay, we got to wait 30 minutes because, we're waiting for a gate crew, or we have to, change something out, or they change the runway, rather than just sitting there. Because that's when people fill in the gap with anger or confusion or misinformation. So the more detail we can provide, the better.
And Jonathan, you just reminded me of something. Let's talk about the reality of when those results are going to get reported. If polls close at 7:30 p.m., that's when the shutdown, that's when the closing of polls is going to happen, and they have to be transported. Tim talked a lot about that. They've got to come back to the County Board of Elections office or some central location. Every precinct voting location is not 5 minutes from the County Board of Elections. I was a county elections director in Transylvania County. We're talking about a mountainous, single, one-way roads or two-lane roads winding through in the dark of night. Sometimes we have ice storms, sometimes we have pouring rain, and most of our workers are 65 and older, and they've been up since 4 a.m., and they have pulled a very long day. If they are faced with, in North Carolina, if someone's in line to vote at 7:30 p.m., they have to process those folks and allow them the opportunity to vote. So, the voting sites, the likelihood of results walking out the door and heading back to the County Board of Elections is not going to be in 30 seconds after the polls close. There's going to be a period of time. And so, if you look around the country, it is very likely that you're not going to see results from Election Day voting sites until an hour to 2 hours, 3 hours because things have to happen. And some of that is the chain of custody that we've talked about, and making sure that everything is secure, making sure that they're safe in the transport back. And so there's just a reality that it doesn't matter how fast we are, there's things we have to dot the I and cross the T to get it back and get it reported.
I think I still have 2 more hands.
Hi, Nick Korsnady here from New York Times. I wanted to go back to the poll watcher discussion earlier. I remember in 2020 there was a lot of debate over their access. Like, can it be 6 feet? Could it be 3 feet? And it ended up even in some lawsuits that was part of the effort to overturn results in some states. And I was just wondering, I know the delegation from Wisconsin, for lack of a better word, it got into some of the law that had been clarified here. But I was wondering if every state has pretty clear law so that there wouldn't be debates over poll watcher access in terms of the distance that they might be able to stand or what they're able to observe, so that there won't be these kind of lawsuits or fights after the election.
We will have a debate in Arizona over observing ballot drop boxes, outdoor ballot drop boxes. We had this in 2022. Injunctive relief was issued, but never a full order. And we don't have clear law on this. And I think that people will sort of push the envelope up to what constitutes voter intimidation with their attire and with their equipment, I think you could generously say. And so I suspect that will wind up being litigated. And it'll actually be kind of an interesting First Amendment question.
Hi, Colby Ekowitz with the Washington Post. I think it was earlier this week, the Associated Press had reported that about a half a dozen election officials had received envelopes with some kind of white powder. I was wondering if you're aware of anything like that happening in your states, or any other kind of threats or intimidation at that level, and how worried you are about that.
In our jurisdiction, we have not encountered that. Although I will say, at my home, I received a package that was suspicious, that shook, and didn't have a full name for their return address. But no worries, it was just a realtor from Florida sending me some baggy Florida coastal sand. I mean, this is what but it had me on guard. Had we not been going through this and seeing what other jurisdictions are experienced or have experienced, I know the thought that there was something that rattled when I was handling this envelope and it was a white powdery substance would have never crossed our mind. So again, it's a matter of vigilance. But again, this isn't something that we've had to deal with. We are prepared for it. We train our mail handlers and my staff, our offices, and our local clerks. But this, again, not something we see, fortunately. And so far, if we have, it's just Florida, beautiful white sand.
So in Arizona, we did receive an envelope, and it was addressed to the Secretary of State's office, to the election department at the Capitol address. And thanks to our team of security experts and the FBI and the mail service, I want to do a shout out to the mail service, because if anybody got run under the bus more than election officials the last few years, it's been the postal workers, who do an amazing job with election mail. But we did receive that envelope. Fortunately, it was intercepted. But it is a challenge, and now we've talked about UOCAVA ballots. The majority of those are sent back electronically, but they could be sent in the mail from different addresses that look, suspicious. So I think for the last few years anyway, we've all been pretty cognizant of that with our people that open the mail, but it is a concern.
We've been notified by the United States Postal Service that there's a package headed our way. They're going to attempt to intersect it like they did the Fulton County fentanyl that came in early this year. We don't know what that is, but we're on the lookout for it, and so are they.
It's the same as in Pennsylvania, and thanks to the mail service and the systems put in place over the past several years, the what was sent did not reach our offices.
I would say that, the same in many ways in Wisconsin, in terms of our preparations for what we would do in the event that happened. I think for us, being a state where, again, we do in-person absentee, which means that when somebody completes an absentee ballot by mail or in the clerk's office, it's put into an envelope and they're not opened until election day at the polls. And so we have a lot of work that we're doing to exercise who would be involved in that process should there be some kind of suspicious mail that's opened at the polls on election day, to make sure that the poll workers, of course, are all safe, the voters are all safe, but that voting is also not disrupted, especially in the event of these sort of, innocuous substances that are being mailed to some states, making sure that something like that, a stunt like that, would not be allowed to interrupt the voting process.
North Carolina, we learned yesterday that there was a packet addressed to the State Board of Elections. It was intercepted before making it to our actual office. The FBI has stepped in, so I'll leave it there for their further investigation. We have not had a situation where a powdery substance or hazardous material has been delivered to our County Board of Elections or the State Board of Elections in recent times. But because we know this is out there, we are certainly working with our state and federal and local partners to be prepared for this. And we have conducted training around hazardous materials. We've shared those materials and are prepared to address any circumstance. But, I'll raise that it's created some interesting conversations, especially with hazardous material agents and law enforcement, about who has jurisdiction and how to continue voting if you fear that you have a hazardous material affecting your polling place or affecting your mail ballots. And I don't think any of us envisioned being in that role or in that circumstance of having to be knowledgeable about hazardous materials in the conduct of elections.
So before we take the last question for this part of the day, I want to alert colleagues, officials. My sense is lightning round has meant different things to different folks. My tradition has an expression, while standing on one foot. So we're going to have each of you give concluding remarks while standing on one foot, metaphorically. And the remarks should be focused on what is the main takeaway for the 24+ journalists. But before we get to that, as you're preparing those remarks, we have another question.
I hope I don't have to stand on one foot. Jane Tim, NBC. I wanted to ask you guys, as you plan your elections and sort of produce this day/weeks-long event, how do you think about visuals? And are you trying to avoid a ginger mint being sort of misconstrued, or are you trying to make sure there aren't suitcases to be misconstrued and taken out of context by the sort of conspiratorial side of our elections?
No. We have a job to do, and I don't care how careful we are, there'll be a moment to be taken out of context where somebody can say that this thing happened that didn't. I'm not going to waste my time worrying about that when I have a more important job to do.
Actually, we have had conversations around that, in part learning from the unexpected experiences that our colleagues had in other states around the country. And so we've had conversations during what we call huddles between the state board and the county election offices about stepping into your office with a different set of goggles. What does someone who's not ingrained in elections see? If they're not familiar with North Carolina law, what do they see? And so it's, sometimes it's just good procedure, and it increases your transparency too when you effectively label containers so that they know what's in that container, especially if it's not a clear container, or putting out signs of what type of meeting is taking place, because you may not have control over someone who's come as a member of the public to watch a meeting who may not have good audio, so they can't hear that those county board members are going through the absentee by mail ballots, looking for the proper number of witnesses as required in our state, looking for the photo ID requirement before they open the ballot and put it in to the tabulator. And so, it's just taking steps to think about how do we convey the checks and balances and the processes that we have in place? Is it as simple as a label, or is it having job aids that we hand out during those meetings so they understand what the processes are?
Since 2021 in Arizona, We have 365, 24/7 video cameras in our tabulation facility, as probably every jurisdiction here has, and you can watch them on our website. And 3 different times, the Gateway Pundit has written, Katie Hobbs, former Secretary of State, now Governor of Arizona, is in the election tabulation center. And all 3 times, it was 3 different women, and none of them were Katie Hobbs. So I talked to HR about this, and I said, can we just keep out any lady with sort of shorter length, light brown hair? And we were told we couldn't do that. But that's a real story in that they wrote that 3 different times. But to Joseph's point, I think that we try to not commit unforced errors. We try not to take pens into the tabulation room. We try not to ever have sort of the buddy system, no one person alone in our tabulation room. But at the end of the day, if somebody really wants to make something look weird, I think they can do it, unfortunately. And so I guess it's just about reacting and then having good protocols in place, as Joseph mentioned.
I'll just add in there that we kind of operate under the tagline, perception is the new reality. So if I perceive it, it must be real. So we act intentionally when we're doing things at the polling place too. So that when we are breaking a seal, which is part of our protocol to do, we are being vocal about it. I am breaking seal 1, 2, 3, 4 to remove the absentee ballot certificate envelopes from this ballot bag so that they can be processed. I am opening the poll. Just everything we do is very intentional, and it can feel uncomfortable, right? To stand up and be loud. But stand up and be loud so that everybody knows what you're doing. So that's one of the training things that we've done, because perception's the new reality. So be intentional with all your actions is the biggest thing that we've done.
Okay, Jonathan, what is your concluding main message for media?
Just to clarify, I don't literally have to stand on 1 foot, right?
Nope,
Okay.
but we're gonna go clockwise and so.
Yeah. Well, I think understand that I hope it's been made clear here that we certainly have different processes across our states, but one thing that is in common is that we have checks and balances that go both across jurisdictions and up and down, whether you're talking about local or state, to ensure that we have checks and balances and integrity in the process, and making sure that people understand that when we're talking about election, it's not run by one person. It's not run by one party. And so these processes work together to ensure the integrity of the election. And then the other takeaway I would just say, I know it's just one, but just keeping in mind the many checks we have after the fact, including paper ballots, paper records, that we can always use in case anything appears to go wrong on election night.
My main message is that elections are the bedrock of our republic, and they're reliant upon public trust in the process. And I've come to firmly believe that the way to build and bolster public trust is through education, participation, and transparency. And remember, elections have always been controversial. That's not new. Certainly we've seen some unprecedented things, but elections have always been and they will always be controversial. They're high stakes. There's tension. But above all, elections are a celebration. Elections are a reminder of the blessings of liberty. And that's the tone that we need to set. That's the tone that I want to take, and that's what I want our voters to hear, so that they have faith, they have confidence, they know our elections are secure, transparent, fair, and accurate.
Yeah, I would just first of all thank everyone who's in attendance today. I mean, this is quite a unique and remarkable event, and I'm honored to be a participant in it. But also just grateful for the many partnerships that we have. I think we have a lot of partnerships within the media and within our communities that I've grown to value even more in my 10 years as an election official. I think one thing for me that's been a takeaway, and as we've obviously demonstrated today, is elections are complex. They are very decentralized. But one thing that's so clear is that elections are also across the board, across the United States, across each one of us at the table, transparent, bipartisan, and they're run by professionals. And I think we need to hone in on that message and let our voters know. I totally agree. I mean, this is a privilege and a joy to do this work. And I think that is something that I want my community to know and sense and feel from me and from our staff and from our election workers. It's an honor to be here doing the work that we're doing, and it matters.
Okay, so they covered pretty much everything I wanted to say already. But get across to the voters that if they're seeing something that doesn't quite make sense, let them know to go to the real sources of that information from their states, from their counties, from their municipal clerks. Get the right information. There's a lot of that flows all over the place. Be skeptical. Tell those voters to go to the right sources to get their information. And if you have questions, please contact us so we can help you understand what you might be seeing also.
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. We've talked a lot about election officials and observers, but also you, the media. You are part of the election story, and you're the medium that's taking our voices and bringing that to the public. So I guess I really want to say thank you. Thanks for being that partner that lets us keep this republic.
Yeah, I echo thank you. The fact that you're here and you're learning all these details about elections is incredible. And I think, elections are so transparent in the sense that, like I like to say, there are no locked doors in elections. There are no dark corners. You can come observe every single part of the election process. But I think an important thing that you all provide and that we hope that we can continue to work on is providing context around that transparency, making sure that voters understand what it is they're looking at and seeing as they read your reporting, as they view the unofficial election night results on the news on election night. Voters need to know what they're looking at. It's not enough just to give them information. We have to provide that context. This is unofficial. The absentees haven't been added to those totals yet. And so I think that's somewhere where conversations like this go a long way in making sure that everyone that's involved in educating the public about opportunities to engage with elections is able to provide that additional context. So thank you all for being a part of that solution.
Ari, I took 15 years of ballet. Just saying. No. But I like this standard. We laughed for a moment. So, there are some profound words in our country about forming a more perfect union. And I think what we know is that we are not perfect, but what we work every day to do is try to perfect how we administer elections. And that's what professionals do in their field. And, at the end of the day, as election professionals, we are guided by one compass, and that is to ensure that every eligible voter is able to exercise their right to vote. And it's just as simple as that. We may go about it in different ways, but at the end of the day, that's what we're all striving to achieve.
So I'm going to say the word transparency for the 100th time today. We've certainly alluded to that multiple times, and we truly mean that. And Heidi asked a question earlier about how do we pre-bunk any malinformation, and that's truly how we can go about pre-bunking is through our transparent processes. And so this is an invitation to you all to take advantage of the local and state elections offices to witness and observe the different procedures that are in place, whether it be the pre-election voting machine testing or the post-election audits that we run, the frequent board meetings that we conduct. So I truly extend an invitation to you all to participate and observe and be a part of the process by witnessing what takes place in conducting free and fair elections.
Relationships matter. That's how every single one of you was invited to this event today. So thank you to our sponsors for making that connection, because everything speaks and relationships matter. So please make those connections, not only on the federal level, on the local levels, with your cities and towns. Election officials are just like everybody else doing a job, and no other profession that I'm aware of requires the amount of time and dedication and sacrifice from their families that they do so we can have elections. And I'm grateful for every single one of them. And I know nobody in this room is one of those media outlets that calls elections 3 hours ahead of Arizona time because we have a big time difference, right? But when that happens, that is devastating to places across from the West when you call those from the East. So thank you for being here today.
I'm cautiously optimistic. Groups like Keep Our Republic, groups like Pillars, conferences like this didn't exist in 2020. And I'm hopeful that they can make the conversation a bit more positive, and I'm hopeful that they can help us get through this. But I think we will have collectively a bloodied nose by the time we're done. But I hope it's just that, and thanks for helping with that.
Elections in the United States and in Pennsylvania have never been more safe and never been more secure and never been more transparent. So it is frustrating for all of us to deal with this perverse dynamic where things have gotten so much better, but people seem to have so much distrust in the process. And that's why, we have an important role to play, and you have such an important role to play as well in sharing accurate information with your readers and with your information consumers. It's critical to the future of our republic that all of that occur. And I would also remind you, the results in Pennsylvania are not delayed on election night. They will take as long as they take to be counted expeditiously and with integrity.
And with
post haste.
There is zero chance that undocumented persons voting would be determinative of a presidential election in the United States of America. There is zero chance that people fraudulently voting for people who are deceased would be determinative of the presidential election in the United States of America.
Yeah, and not to reiterate what's been said here at the tail end of this, but just appreciate everybody being here. Appreciate letting everybody tell their story. In a county like Allegheny, we have a lot of salt of the earth people that work really hard to make this all happen. And, I appreciate you telling their story as well. They're average people. They go home to children, families. They watch the Steelers on Sunday. It really hurts when we see this stuff and threats and all this other stuff. So to stay on message would be much appreciated. And thanks for having me.
Well, first, Lamont, well said. I appreciate you. And I appreciate y'all being here. As other people mentioned, you are our partners in this, and thank you for that. That being said, words matter, facts matter. If you can't tell, we like to talk about this stuff. So do other local officials. As you need to know what words to say, what words to use, call us, ask. We want to help you get the word out. We need your help telling our story. As a parting gift, I hope you want to be online with this. I was here a week ago for a different event and had the opportunity to meet somebody from the Election Reformers Network. They have a project called the Election Overtime Project. It is detailed explanations of how elections work in the battleground states. I was frankly impressed by the one about Georgia. There's a few things I got to send them to update it. But if you want some good, factual reference material, that's where I would go.
Those of us that work in the election space, we're dedicated to following our oath. And I will follow my oath. I'll make sure we have fair and honest elections. And when we honor our oaths, we're actually honoring our founders and our founding principles. And that's what we're called to do. And you, the voter, can also honor your oath and honor the founders' principles by when you vote. Let's all be good citizens. When we do that, we're a better nation. I love America, and I know you do too. And that's why we're fully invested in this election. And that's why we're going to follow our oath to make sure you have fair and honest elections.
With that, thank you all for coming. We hope we've given you a lot of awfully good information, which I think we have. And we hope we've introduced you to people who are the source of what is actually happening on Election Day, and that you'll take advantage of having gotten to know them better, to call them when the moments of terror come around the election.